Late afternoon. Maya is sitting on the floor of her bedroom surrounded by open boxes, taking photos of her own belongings for an online marketplace, her old laptop, clothes she barely wears, a guitar she learned to play in college, books she once promised herself she would reread. And she carefully wipes dust off everything before taking pictures, not because she cares about presentation, but because each item feels like a small piece of her past she is about to trade for rent. And her phone keeps buzzing with messages from buyers asking stupid questions about condition and price, negotiating over $10 or $20, while she calculates in her head how many objects she needs to sell just to cover 1 month of living. And she remembers how these things used to represent who she was, her interests, her plans, her identity. And now they are reduced to numbers, listings, and descriptions. And she feels this quiet humiliation that no one sees because from the outside it just looks like minimalism or decluttering, while in reality it is slow self-erasure. And when someone finally confirms the purchase of her guitar, the instrument she once played when she felt hopeful about the future, she hesitates before replying, holding it in her hands, feeling the worn strings under her fingers. And for a moment, she considers canceling the deal, but then she thinks about unpaid bills, landlord messages, and the growing panic of instability. And she presses confirm, realizing that survival is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just selling your own life piece by piece without anyone noticing. Later that evening, Maya meets the buyer in a small cafe near the metro station, sits down with a guitar case placed carefully between her feet like something fragile, and from the first seconds she feels how unreal the situation is, how strange it is to sell something that was once part of her everyday life to a complete stranger who sees it only as an object with a price. And while the buyer orders coffee and jokes about traffic, Maya nods politely, smiling in the right moments, even though her mind is drifting back to the first time she held that guitar, to evenings spent learning chords, to moments when she believed music might become more than just a hobby. And now, all those memories feel compressed into a single silent transaction. And when the buyer finally opens the case and starts inspecting the instrument like a product in a store, checking scratches, tuning strings, asking practical questions about condition and sound, Maya answers calmly, using neutral words, trying not to show that for her this is not a deal but a farewell. And she notices how easy it is for people to negotiate over small amounts of money without realizing what that amount represents for someone else. How the buyer hesitates over $10 while Maya is calculating rent, groceries, transport, and overdue bills in her head. And when the payment notification finally appears on her phone, she feels a short moment of relief, followed immediately by emptiness. Because the money does not feel like gain, it feels like compensation for loss. And walking home with lighter hands and heavier thoughts, she understands that this is what financial instability really looks like. Not dramatic poverty, not visible disaster, but constant emotional compromise, selling parts of your identity to maintain a basic level of existence. And the most painful part is that no one involved sees it as tragic. For the buyer, it is just another purchase. For society, it is just a normal transaction. But for her, it is another silent step toward a life where survival slowly replaces everything that once made her feel like a person. The next morning, Maya wakes up earlier than usual, even though she barely slept, her body tense and her mind already running through practical concerns before she even opens her eyes. And she lies in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what else she can sell, what objects are still left that have any value, how many months she can realistically survive like this before there is nothing meaningful left to trade. And she walks around her room slowly, looking at her shelves, her clothes, her desk, seeing everything not as personal space anymore, but as potential inventory. And she notices how this shift in perception feels almost violent, like being forced to see your own life through the eyes of a market. And she remembers how these things once represented stability, personality, memories, and now they are reduced to photos, prices, and descriptions. And she realizes that financial pressure does not just limit your choices, it changes how you relate to yourself, how you measure worth, how you define identity. And as she opens another box and takes out old letters, souvenirs, small meaningless objects she kept for emotional reasons, she feels a strange hesitation because these are not worth money, but they are worth something internally. And she understands that the real crisis is not losing material things, but slowly losing the emotional permission to value anything that cannot be monetized. And standing there, surrounded by her own past, Maya feels the quiet fear that one day she will no longer distinguish between what is valuable and what is sellable. That afternoon, Maya goes to work and tries to act normal, answering emails, smiling at colleagues, participating in small conversations about weekend plans and future goals, even though inside her head everything feels distant and unreal, like she's playing a role in a life that no longer belongs to her. And she notices how easily people talk about buying new phones, traveling, upgrading apartments, making investments, while she is mentally calculating how many more personal items she needs to sell just to stay afloat. And she feels this growing gap between her external behavior and her internal reality, because nothing in her appearance shows crisis. She looks fine, functional, stable, and this invisibility feels almost more painful than open struggle. And during lunch break, she scrolls through her marketplace listings again, replying to messages from strangers interested in her belongings, negotiating prices while sitting in an office chair surrounded by people who think she is just like them. And she realizes how modern instability hides behind normality, how people can be emotionally and financially collapsing while still attending meetings, paying subscriptions, and pretending everything is under control. And she understands that society often only recognizes suffering when it becomes extreme, homelessness, breakdown, disaster, but ignores the long, silent phase where people are slowly dismantling their lives piece by piece without ever leaving the system. And as she closes her laptop at the end of the day, Maya feels a deep exhaustion that has nothing to do with work, but with the constant effort of maintaining a version of herself that no longer exists. Late at night, Maya sits on the floor of her room, surrounded by open boxes, empty shelves, and objects she has not yet listed for sale. And for the first time, she truly feels how much of her life has already disappeared without leaving a visible trace. And she starts noticing details she ignored before. Small scratches on the desk where she once studied, faded posters from concerts she attended years ago, notebooks filled with unfinished ideas. And she realizes that every item in this room once represented a moment when she believed in something beyond basic survival. And now all those moments are being converted into temporary financial relief. And she feels this deep internal conflict between logic and emotion, between the part of her that understands she needs money and the part that resists turning her entire past into a series of transactions. And she begins to understand how poverty is not only about lacking resources, but about being forced to reinterpret your own history as a problem to be solved, a collection of assets to be liquidated. And she notices how even her thinking has changed, how she now automatically evaluates everything in terms of resale value, usefulness, practicality, and how slowly this mindset is erasing her emotional attachment to things, making detachment feel necessary, even healthy. And she wonders what happens to a person who spends years in this mode, constantly giving up pieces of themselves in exchange for temporary stability, and whether there is a point where you stop remembering why those pieces mattered in the first place. And sitting there in the quiet, she feels a growing fear that the real loss is not material, but internal, the gradual transformation into someone who no longer expects continuity, who lives without long-term imagination, who measures existence in months instead of years. And she understands that this kind of survival leaves no visible scars, no dramatic breakdown, only a subtle emotional numbness that spreads slowly until life becomes something you manage instead of something you live. The next day, Maya meets her mother for lunch, something she has been postponing for weeks because she knows exactly how the conversation will go. The polite questions about work, about plans, about whether she is saving money, followed by advice that sounds reasonable but feels completely disconnected from reality. And as they sit in a small restaurant, Maya answers automatically, saying that everything is fine, that she is just tired, that work is stressful but manageable. And she watches how easily concern turns into solutions, suggestions to find a better job, to move somewhere cheaper, to be more careful with spending. And she realizes how difficult it is to explain systemic problems in personal language, how impossible it is to make someone understand that there is no single decision that can fix a life shaped by constant instability. And she notices how even love becomes complicated under financial pressure, because honesty feels dangerous. It creates worry, disappointment, expectations she cannot meet. And as her mother talks about the future, about retirement, about stability, about how things eventually settle down, Maya feels a quiet sadness because she cannot imagine that future anymore, not for herself, not in concrete terms. And she understands that the generational gap is not just about age, but about economic reality. Her mother's world was built around the idea that effort leads to security, while hers feels built around the idea that security is temporary and conditional. In leaving the restaurant, Maya hugs her mother a little longer than usual, realizing that the hardest part of growing up in this reality is not independence, but learning how to hide exhaustion from the people who love you. That evening, Maya takes public transport home and stands pressed between strangers, holding onto a metal pole while advertisements above her head promise better lives through new phones, fitness programs, luxury apartments, and personal success courses. And she feels a strange disconnect between these messages and her own reality, because everything being sold assumes a future that feels abstract to her, a future where planning makes sense, where investment is possible, where long-term goals are realistic. And she realizes how much modern culture is built around aspiration, while so many people are living in maintenance mode, just trying to stay functional. And she watches the faces around her, tired eyes, neutral expressions, bodies moving automatically, and she understands that this silent exhaustion is collective, not personal, that entire generations are being taught to normalize stress, instability, and emotional depletion as the price of adulthood. And she thinks about how rarely people talk honestly about this, how success stories dominate while survival stories stay invisible. And she feels this quiet solidarity with the strangers around her, all of them carrying invisible pressure, debts, fears, and compromises. And for a moment, she imagines what would happen if people were allowed to admit that they are not chasing dreams, they are managing damage. And she wonders whether acknowledging this reality would change anything, or whether society depends on people believing that their struggle is temporary, individual, and solvable through more effort. And as the train moves through the dark tunnels, she feels the uncomfortable truth settle inside her, that the real crisis is not lack of opportunity, but the emotional cost of pretending that endless effort without stability is normal. Late at night, Maya finally arrives home, carrying a small grocery bag in one hand and her phone buzzing constantly with new messages from potential buyers in the other. And she sits on the edge of her bed, exhausted in body and mind, realizing that the day was filled with invisible labor she cannot put on a resume, a series of negotiations, compromises, and mental calculations that nobody outside would ever recognize as work. And she notices how this has slowly reshaped her perception of herself and her surroundings, how she automatically evaluates everything she owns, every minute she spends, every interaction she has, in terms of survival or utility. And she feels a quiet grief for the life she once imagined, when choices were made out of desire rather than necessity, when weekends were for experiences and friendships instead of planning how to stretch limited funds. And she understands that financial pressure does more than reduce options. It compresses identity, makes emotional attachment to people and things feel dangerous, and normalizes emotional detachment as a survival strategy. And lying there in the dim light, she reflects on the cumulative weight of months and years spent managing scarcity, realizing that the most exhausting part is not the money itself, but the constant mental labor it demands, the unrelenting tension between who she is and who she is forced to become. And she feels a strange mix of resentment, fear, and determination, knowing that survival may continue to define her present, but it cannot completely erase her desire for something beyond existence, something real, something that belongs to her. And as the apartment grows quiet around her, she allows herself to imagine, however briefly, a future where life is not just about coping, where the small victories of each day are not simply holding on, but moments of genuine living. And she knows that even if that future is distant, acknowledging its possibility is already a small act of resistance against the slow erasure of her own story. The next morning, Maya wakes up before the alarm, the pale sunlight slipping through the curtains, and she lies in bed for a few minutes, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, feeling the weight of yesterday's compromises still pressing on her chest. And she notices how her body has learned exhaustion as a constant state, how her mind has been trained to calculate every action in terms of survival rather than fulfillment. And she thinks about the months she has spent selling pieces of herself, her belongings, her memories, her own sense of stability in exchange for temporary relief. And she realizes that this slow erosion is what modern life feels like for so many people. A series of invisible transactions that gradually reshape identity and expectation. And she understands that the hardest part is not the lack of money, not the long hours, not the exhaustion itself, but the subtle normalization of scarcity, the way society quietly trains people to accept instability as inevitable. And she sees how easy it is to adapt to a life where survival replaces living, where routines replace dreams, where emotional detachment becomes a habit. And for a long moment, she allows herself to feel the full weight of that truth, the quiet anger, the frustration, the fear. And yet she also feels a spark of awareness, the recognition that her reality is shaped not only by circumstance, but by her responses, by her choices, by the moments she decides to act with attention rather than autopilot. And she sits up, stretches, and for the first time in a long while, she allows herself to imagine taking a small step, not an escape, not a revolution, but a deliberate act to reclaim presence, to make a choice that belongs to her rather than necessity. And as she steps into the kitchen, checks her messages, and starts planning her day, she understands that survival will always demand effort. But living, truly living, begins in those small, intentional acts that refuse to let the system dictate the entirety of her being. And even if the change is imperceptible to the world around her, it is real and it is hers.